Hello, and welcome to day 2 of the 5th International Meeting on Internet and Audiology. If you're just joining us for the first time, we're glad you're here. If you were here yesterday, we're glad you're back. We started yesterday with an excellent presentation followed by a discussion of patient-centered care and e-health. We talked about challenges and opportunities for teleaudiology, and we had an interactive session with over 50 presentations where most of the authors were present to discuss their work. And today we're going to continue the discussion. Just a couple of technical reminders. Remember, in WebEx, when you're in panel discussion, you have control over the layout. So you can go to a grid layout, or you can choose a stack layout, whichever one works for you. And you can also put your questions in the chat during the keynote or during the panels. You can always put your questions in the chat, and then the moderator of the panel will ask the panelists or the keynotes to answer the questions. Also, today we don't everything will be in one WebEx event. So if you are joined now, you don't need to sign off and sign in again. You can just stay in for the duration, for the 3 hours of this event. And just like yesterday, we'll have Gather Town afterwards. So stop by, say hello. All the presentations are also available in Gather Town. So this is all for me. And now I would like to turn this to Gabby Saunders, who will introduce the theme for today. I will introduce our keynote speakers.
Our 5th Internet and Audiology meeting. It's really fabulous to see so many of you out there. I hope you all enjoyed yesterday as much as I did, and that today we can kind of live up to what we managed yesterday. So our first session today, we're looking at social media and hearing. And the session was inspired by work that I'd been reading about, in which I'd seen that there were people who were using social media postings. They were mining information to detect outbreaks of disease. And it seemed like that with some modeling, they could actually detect outbreaks of certain diseases like influenza outbreaks before the public health and epidemiological systems could pick it up. And I thought, wow, that is really cool. And then I thought, well, what can we in audiology learn about social media? Sort of maybe it's about attitudes to hearing, what are people worried about, what do they want more information about, etc. And so that's where I got thinking. And obviously I'm not the only one, because we've got all our panel members today who've clearly done a bit more than thinking about it. They've actually looked at it. And we'll come on to that later. But now onto our keynote presentation on the topic. So I personally always think that really we all learn way more if we look outside our field than stay insular inside our field. And particular when we think about chronic conditions that've got commonalities with hearing loss, like stigma and a sort of invisibility and things that affect mental well-being and such like. And so we reached out to Matteo Cella and his colleague Sigar Jilka, who are at King's College at the University of London. They work at the Institutes of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience. Now, Matteo's research focuses on psychological interventions for people with psychosis, and he also looks at using digital technologies like wearables and mobile phones, etc., virtual reality to improve assessment and interventions. And Sigar is a data scientist who's interested in developing ways to involve service users and patients to improve data science and machine learning applications. So this obviously is a really good pairing for sort of mining social media. And so that's what they're going to present on today, stigma and mental health, what can be learned from social media. Now, I will just say we're really lucky to have him here for 2 reasons. First of all, when I wrote to Sigar, I wrote to Matteo, and I kind of knew that he was going to get this invite to the Internet and Audiology meeting and probably ignore the email thinking, oh, that can't be for me, or that's one of these spam things. So I was really glad he actually looked at the email. And also him and his family have been ill this past weekend, but he's managed to get up off his sickbed and be with us. So anyway, I'm going to pass you over now to Matteo and Sigar, who are going to share this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby, for the kind introduction. And I'm glad to hear that some of the pathway into this type of research are very similar. I also looked at the sort of similar research that Google has done in terms of predicting pandemics and things like that. And we try to apply it to mental health. So now I'm going to try to show. So this is our conflict of interest and disclosure, both ours. And this is what we would like to talk about today. So in the first part of the presentation, I introduced stigma and how it's related and relevant to mental health conditions. Then I'll talk a little bit about how we measure stigma and the sort of centerpiece of the talk with all the methodological elements will be covered by Saga. And then about social media and stigma. And then in the end, I'll try to sort of look at big picture consideration and take a look at the future and what this work might sort of have in store. So what is stigma? I just started with the definition from Goffman, which is a traditional, the classic definition of stigma, which is a deeply discrediting attribute that reduces somebody or someone or a person from a whole to a lesser version of the self. I think that was a definition of about 50 years old. And in sort of today's terminology, maybe it's easier to grasp something more along the line of stereotypes, negative view that are attributed to a person or group of people, and essentially they're discrediting views that sort of are lessening the value of a person or intended to lessen the value of a person in society. Another sort of important consideration when considering stigma is that stigma is more likely to happen for those characteristics that are the extreme of the distribution, so they are less frequent in the population, and for those characteristics that are complex and difficult to understand. So when we talk about illnesses, we talk about illnesses with complex etiology and sort of difficult for people to grasp. So stigma and mental health have been quite closely related, and if you were to pass me this, the concept of stigma has been largely developed around mental health, at least to start with. And we know that stigma is very much prevalent in mental health conditions, but is not evenly distributed. I work clinically with people with psychosis, and this is an area where stigma is quite prevalent. And I think maybe a few years ago, the prevalent view around psychosis was that people with psychosis were dangerous and unpredictable, and that's why people were kind of guarded to sort of interact with them or had sort of negative views about those. But there are other ways in which stigma affect other mental health conditions, such as eating disorder and chronic fatigue, that are perceived as controllable. These are some things that occur in most people's life, and it's just an extreme, and these are people that can't sort of cope with something that most people are able to do, which is very much not the case. But of course, stigma is not just in mental health, is prevalent in HIV due to the perception of being associated with the LGBT community, but also in other conditions such as tuberculosis and epilepsy. So I just want to spend literally 1 minute saying why stigma is important. Sometimes people tell you about concept in conferences, but they forget to tell you why this is important. And there is a very good rationale to focus on stigma. Stigma undermines seeking behavior or delays diagnosis or compromise diagnosis, or make diagnosis being challenged by the person. It is so negatively affecting treatment, and therefore sort of linking to less positive outcomes altogether. These are sort of the importance of stigma for the individual. Obviously, there are other repercussions at the societal level that make stigma sort of relevant. So we describe stigma as a sort of derogatory or negative characterization of a condition, but it's not all about the derogatory and the overt, clear negative connotation of a condition. It's also something that people have started to pay attention to a bit more closely in recent years. That's called trivialization, which is essentially minimizing behavior where an illness is conceptualized as being easy to acquire, suffer or treat. And this is the example I gave earlier about eating disorder and chronic fatigue, where you think, well, this is just the extreme of a normal situation, and just people can't get a handle of it, essentially, which is again a misconception. And trivialization, and this research has been done more recently, can arise, always thought to arise, when the diagnosis, the concept or terminology attached to it is in common currency or common use in language, and then people tend to have a misconception about it. And I've presented here a couple of examples. If the slide assists me, sorry, that's been a slight glitch. Here we go. So a couple of examples of trivialization in one in the media, and this is a detective monk, which those of you in the US might remember a few years ago is not quite a crime fiction, but is a detective series. And the trivializing element in these series is that these detectives are particularly effective and good at solving crime because they have obsessive compulsive disorder. And this is a characteristic that, in the view of this series, help the detective be meticulous and quite thorough in their investigation, which again is just not quite the case if you have OCD. Is a something quite negative to have, and is not definitely described as a positive characteristic. And another example of trivialization that was quite picked up very much in social media a few years ago, I think 3 or 4 years ago, are the mental health patient fancy dress costumes, which eventually were attracted, and I'm pleased to say they are hopefully not in circulation any longer, but there's quite a lot of outrage about those. But that's, I think, even like people considering producing these fancy dress costume is a sign that again the illness is not quite well understood. So how do we measure stigma? Traditionally, stigma is measured by looking at content of the media. So in international surveys looking at stigma, there's researchers who go and look at the content of media. You know, back in the days it was papers, actually physical papers, and now it's gone more kind of on what the online news outlets tend to produce. But my claim here is that this does not correspond to the perception of how stigma is prevalent and thought of in other population levels. So there is a filter by journalists that doesn't allow us to get to what the actual people in society think and would say about certain conditions. So there's editorial filter, journalistic kind of appraisal, and maybe what helps selling a paper that kind of goes into it. So it's not well, my claim here is it's not quite an accurate representation of what stigma is like in society. So we thought that social media would be a good platform to measure stigma. But first, just a little thought about what people might think that social media can do to stigma or would do to stigma. And this is the result of my very unscientific chats that I had before starting doing this research. But my impression is that most people instinctively think social media is bad news for stigma, or particularly for mental health stigma. But when I sort of went and have a look it's more of a mixed picture where there's some definitely distress or exacerbation of mental health distress, and perception of mental illness is definitely, for some people, and in some cases, not considered positively. But there are also campaigns to raise awareness, and so people can link up with other people having this similar sort of experience and share their experience. So that there is also a lot of positive. So it's a bit of a mix, or it's more of a mixed picture, really. And now we're starting to delve more into the actual research, the more recent research that's looked at mental health and social media. This was one of the first papers in this area. Now it's almost like 6-7 years old, looking at the frequency of stigmatizing tweets in two invisible conditions, one a mental health, one schizophrenia, and the second one is being diabetes. And as you can see from the bars, the frequency of negativity and inappropriate tweets associated with schizophrenia was much higher than compared to diabetes. And this is another example of research that looked at the prevalence of depression, of stigmatizing tweets in depression and in schizophrenia, and it's the two terminology that they use to search on social media, and in particular these in the previous one were on Twitter, over a period of 7 days. And as you can see, the prevalence of stigmatizing tweets is higher for schizophrenia compared to depression. And these were the sort of two pieces of research that prompted us to start our journey in sort of social media and stigma research, particularly around trying to find ways of reducing it. But our journey started with, how do we code it? How do we recognize reliably stigma? And I think we sort of started from the limitation of the previous research, and we wanted to sort of expand and make sure that we could characterize it and also have a better handle on the prevalence. And this is sort of what we've done. We've looked at 5 mental health and 5 physical health conditions, all invisible, and we collected a higher number of tweets over a much longer period. The issue that we face, and this is what Saga is going to talk about and hopefully provide a solution, is that we ended up tweeting all of the tweets manually and independently by different raters, which was an exorbitant amount of work. But these are our results, and as you can see, again, schizophrenia is stopping the stigmatization ranking. But we also looked at trivialization because we thought that would be an important sort of aspect to capture. And as you can see, they're not going hand to hand like a condition like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Trivialization is much higher than in schizophrenia or any other condition. But as you can see, the stigmatization or the stigma seems to be higher and the trivialization seems to be higher for mental health condition or particular mental health conditions, and HIV/AIDS also has got quite high rates of stigma in line with previous research. So we found essentially results that align well with sort of previous research findings. And these are some of the examples. I'll let you to read those, but these are some of the examples that we found across the conditions that we considered. And then we thought, okay, we had our paper out, our piece of research completed, cycled, and you think like, what's going to happen next? And we thought about some limitations of what we've done, and the current study tend to be a snapshot of a particular period, not necessarily very long. That manual coding is very labor intensive, and coding thousands and thousands of tweets might be not practical to do on a regular basis, and particularly if you want to look at longer periods of time. And that we noticed that there are what we call temporal biases, but there are particular events in society that are talked about with large sort of prevalence in social media, and they can really put a spin on how certain terminology is used. And the US election, for instance, is an event that kind of is talked quite widely in social media, and can put a spin on how certain terminology is used. But also we want to know if we can use a computer to automate the process, if we can develop a reliable method, and if we can, how we can use it to reduce stigma. And this is kind of where my expertise sort of ended, and that's where Saga's expertise sort of came in, and we had some fruitful conversation, and then it basically took off with a sort of automated detection of stigma, which is the work that we're doing now, and Saga is going to talk about.
Thanks, Matteo, and hi everybody. So yeah, I mean, Matteo set the scene really well there. I mean, the idea of that the next phase of our work was to create an automated way to identify stigmatizing tweets, and it was a bit complicated and machine learning in order to create this automated stigma classifier. So on the next slide, what we have here is an example of what we mean by machine learning. So in machine learning, there's several branches, but two main branches: unsupervised and supervised. And what supervised machine learning is when you give a computer some features about an object, and you have to tell the computer, train the computer, so you tell the computer what category that item belongs to, and then it's able to predict new data based on what it's learned. So in this case, we've got an example here where we'll show a computer what an apple is, and we'll tell the computer, this is an apple, it's red, it's round, and it has no appeal. And then we'll also show it we'll tell the computer that this is an orange, its color is orange, it's round, and it has appeal. And then we'll give the computer loads of examples of apples and oranges, and then it will learn all of this information, and then we'll present the computer with a new item, and we'll tell it this is it's orange, it's round, and it has appeal. And then hopefully, because the computer's learnt what an orange is, it'll turn around and say, I think this description that it's orange, round, and has appeal fits the object of it being an orange, and the computer will hopefully say it's an orange. So in this example, we're using apple and orange, but in our project we're using tweets, and the idea is very different because, well, the concept is the same, but the actual medium is different, because in tweets we're using text. And on the next slide we describe a little bit about how we deal with text, which is through a process called natural language processing. And this is a field that's completely taken off, and most tech companies are using it. And natural language processing is just a way of understanding, generating, and analyzing everyday human language, doing things like sentiment analysis. So lots of companies do sentiment analyses on their social media data. So you can analyze comments or Facebook or Twitter posts to look at how positive or negative customers are being. And this example in the middle, this little video, is that things like Gmail or your emails. If you're wondering sometimes why an email ends up in your spam filter, that's a form of NLP and machine learning. That's kind of identifying what the computer thinks is spam based on millions and millions of data, and then it kind of just shifts it or sifts it to say, this is spam. But it's also being used in chatbots and all these kind of, Alexas and Siris and all that sort of stuff. Chatbots is the classic form of NLP, or natural language processing. So, we're trying to combine natural language processing and supervised machine learning to create this automated classifier. So on the next slide, please, Matteo, we've got one of the key principles that we wanted to focus on is ensuring that we understand stigma from the service user's perspective. So these are people who have experienced, who have used mental health services, who have, you might call them patients, but people, who have experienced poor mental health, and we we spoke to these group of people and we said, look, we need your help. We want to understand what does mental health stigma mean to you? What does stigma on social media mean to you? And if we give you a bunch of tweets, can you identify, like, can you kind of help us pick out what are the characteristics in these tweets that that make you not like them, basically, that make you think that they're negative? And then alongside that, we presented them with various ways to define how you can evaluate machine learning models, because in the machine learning literature, there's lots of evaluation metrics, which I will talk about in a minute, like the accuracy of a model or various other metrics. And we wanted to know what's important to service users, basically, like how would they value a percentage, if we say it's 91% accurate, well, what does that mean, really? So we had these in-depth conversations with these young people, and the conclusions were on the next slide. We can see that particularly in terms of this evaluating the model, service users told us that a high accuracy is important. How high accuracy is the agreement, so the percentage agreement between the humans, or in this case, the service users, and the computer or the model. So in this bottom left-hand corner, you see this this matrix, this 2x2 matrix, where you've got the computer's rating of a tweet being stigmatizing and neutral, and you've got the human's rating of a tweet being stigmatizing and neutral. So the two green boxes, the numbers in there, is a indication of the agreement between the two sources. And then what was also interesting is that service users also wanted a low false negative rate. So false negatives are the number of times when the model, so the computer, mistakenly identifies a stigmatizing tweet as not stigmatizing. So the humans think, actually, this is a really bad tweet, it's making me unwell, I think it's very stigmatizing, but the computer doesn't pick that up. And so minimizing false negatives was really important to service users. So we had this in mind. And then if on the next slide, please, Matteo, we've got we asked service users, we said, okay, well, look, we're going to give you a bunch of tweets and we want you to tell us if it's stigmatizing, if it's stigmatizing, put a 1 next to it, and if it's not, if you think it's neutral, not stigmatizing, put a 0 next to it. And just some examples of tweets on the next slide. You can see here that the first tweet, we said, okay, psychosis can wax and wane over an hourly, daily, weekly basis, Benedict says, #Exantus. People thought this was not stigmatizing. There was agreement that this should be a 0. But there were other tweets like psychotic child killer on the street sends confession by the Daily Mail online. That was identified as a stigmatizing tweet. And another one, had to call the police on a schizo in my building's parking garage. That was. So you can see that there might be characteristics in these tweets that are stigmatizing, and service users helped identify these characteristics. So this is all about kind of part of the natural language processing. Are there features in these tweets that we're reading that essentially highlight that this might be stigmatizing? So people said, oh, the use of the word schizo can be quite stigmatizing, but how in the first tweet it says psychosis. And maybe if that said schizo or something along those lines, then it might have been classed as stigmatizing. So given this data, we're building up a picture, but now essentially we need the computer to learn what we're doing. So what we did was we collected loads of tweets, 13,000 tweets. This is using Twitter's API, so this is just a way that allows computer scientists and data scientists to connect to Twitter and collect tweets. So these are all public tweets, and we collected tweets that mention the word keywords like psychosis or schizophrenia, and these are all words taken from our previous paper that Matteo mentioned in 2018. We took a sample of those tweets, 750, and we asked people to rate them as either neutral or stigmatizing, as you've just seen, basically. And then we did a whole load of natural language processing, trying to identify and pick out, what's making these. How can we identify stigma? Is it words like schizo or psycho? And then we tested a whole load of these models, and then we did lots of validation with service users. We said, okay, well, this model is identifying this group of tweets are stigmatizing. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And through this kind of back and forth process, we identified what we thought was the best model, and then we applied that model to all 13,000 tweets. So all the data we collected, we said, okay, now let's scale this up. We've found a relatively good model. Let's scale this up to all the tweets we've collected, and let's see how good it is, basically. And then essentially, what did we find? So what we found was, on the next slide, please, Matteo. First of all, we're looking here at the kind of things that make a tweet stigmatizing or not. And on the left-hand side, we have this measure of sentiment. And sentiment, we can sentiment is essentially just the emotional content of a tweet. And so the higher up on the y-axis the bar goes, it's more positive, and the more negative, or lower down the y-axis, the more negative the content of a tweet. And here you can see that stigmatizing tweets were identified as, more negative, that they were worse in sentiment. And interestingly, the other thing we identified was subjectivity. So the more stigmatizing tweets essentially were more subjective, and that meant they used words like I, we, believe, I think, these kind of subjective words more as compared to neutral tweets. So initially we started building a picture of how do you identify these, what classifies tweets as stigmatizing or not, and this is all done through the computer's brain, basically. And then in terms of our machine learning, what we found was, on the next slide, please, Matteo, that as I said, we ran several models, but the top two performing ones was something called a support vector machine and a random forest. We did lots of validation exercises as well on these two top performing models, and the support vector machine came out on top with accuracy of 91%. It's a great accuracy. It's agreeing with service users 91% of the time, and the number of false and negatives was very low. So it's very good at identifying these stigmatizing tweets. And then we applied this model, as I said, to the 13,000 tweets that we had in the data set, and these are tweets that have come from all over the world, from a whole range of people that the data is just too big to identify. So that's why we use machine learning. And on the next slide, please, Matteo, we can see that that across all of these tweets, we removed some tweets. That's why it says n equals 12,145, because they weren't in English, or just were ambiguous. But we found prevalence of stigma in these tweets was almost 50%. So 47% of all these tweets were stigmatizing. And when you scale up, when you're looking at stigmatizing tweets, they're also more negative than neutral tweets. So the mean sentiment we've got here is minus 0.22. So it's negative on sentiment compared to the neutral tweets. And in some cases, Twitter users will provide a location, so we can see what country a user's from. And what we found was that the USA produced the most tweets. We had just under 5,000, and almost half of those were stigmatizing, whereas there were other countries that produced loads of tweets. I mean, in Canada, just 933. That was a lot in our in our corpus, but very few are stigmatizing. So we're able to using machine learning scale up and understand the kind of landscape, the international landscape of stigma, and then what we're hoping to do is look at kind of what characteristics of certain locations as well. Yeah, but over to you, Matteo.
Thank you, Saga. We are on the conclusion. Can you put on mute, Saga? I can hear some echo. Thank you. So we are at the conclusions for our talk, so it was a bit in two parts. So the beginning was just an introduction, and try to sort of lead you to where we got to in terms of our research, and then I think the more sort of technical elements were also proving interesting, and sort of where we were heading with this, hopefully with application that might be more appropriate for our other fields, such as the field of this conference, or the topic of this conference, which Sagar and I have agreed that is out of our comfort area. So, but hopefully that would be of interest. So just to wrap it all up, I wanted to sort of emphasize a few things and then maybe take a look at the future. So one is that, well, social media represent to a degree societal views, and if you compare it to the previous research conducted on media only, we can definitely see the stigma is still around and is very much prevalent. And the more you apply a thorough method and you look at larger sample sets, the more the prevalence of stigma seems to be going up. But I'm not going to be latching onto a number. Our two studies sort of replicated sort of higher levels of stigma in schizophrenia, people with schizophrenia, or around the terminology used for schizophrenia. But it is definitely prevalent, it's definitely still there, and it's just not going away. It's difficult to say if social media are definitely bad or negative for it, because there is also a lot of good that goes on in social media around discussions on mental health and sort of sharing of information. So we're not here to say they're bad or good, and we're not going to be able to change it. So we have to live with it. We definitely know that some conditions are more stigmatized than others, and I think that's probably where targeted effort should be more concerted. So if a condition is just getting a really bad press on social media, maybe we can do something about it. And there are global mental health campaigns that have sort of tried to achieve that aim of reducing stigma, but potentially a counter and unwanted effect of these campaigns has been to put particular words in people's mouth and kind of making them become part of the common language or the common use, and that has not always produced positive results, and trivialization is or might be an offshoot of that. But because I'm a clinician, and I just want to think about practically what we can do to make things better. And these are sort of ideas that Sagan and I have been in the days where we could meet for coffee, just chats about, and they are sort of tantalizing ideas. But one is, if we can develop a reliable method to detect stigma that relies on machine learning or an automated process, then we can have something like a stigmatometer, or a measure of stigma that goes over time. And we can see how certain events, certain campaigns, certain location might interact or change the stigmatizing attitude over time. And this is just, I think, a precondition for measuring public health campaigns and other things that you might want to do on social media to see what's the feel at the population level, or what people think of a particular condition at a particular point in time. Then another more immediate thing is similar to targeted advertising. When you scroll in your tweet feed, and is your tweet feed receive information from all other information in the background, knows that you like coffee, and then it pops in like a Starbucks ad or a promoted advert. Then similarly, for those who maybe share a lot of stigmatizing content, we can sort of target some advertising on some campaign material or training, or sort of ads that sort of might emphasize the importance of the way you talk on social media, the way you express your views. And then the third and last idea is having, similar to what a parental control device is on your TV for children, maybe some filter that might sort of help to allow people to screen out or to block stigmatizing tweets. So if a particular situation, if people might feel a bit vulnerable or don't want to bump into certain content, they might decide to turn on the filter, and then all the stigmatizing tweets could be sort of filtered out. So these are sort of ideas on how this could become a bit more practical in the future, but I thought I'll share it with you, because it's always good to have a look at the future, and how from a bunch of people rating tweets manually, we must sort of make something with a longer lasting impact. So this is the end of our presentation. If you're listening to the recorded one, perhaps questions might be a bit more complicated, but these are contact details, and these are all the people they would like to thank. And thank you very much for your attention. I saw some question popping up, but they disappear from my screen for now. So if
I can ask the questions. Thank you both so much. I love the big ideas at the end. I think that's wonderful. Why don't you unshare your screen, just so you're both a little bigger. And then I'm assuming we should start bringing the panel members, but I will ask a couple of questions while that's happening. So one question that somebody had said was, you know, in hearing and audiology, we often talk about stigma and self-stigma associated with hearing loss. Trivialization isn't a term that we refer to. And so I don't know if you know, it's something that would be obvious to you as to what trivialization of hearing loss might be. Someone else pointed out that maybe that's kind of the idea that is very typical in hearing, that people say, oh, don't worry, you're getting old, your hearing's going to go, don't worry about it. Is that what you mean by trivialization of a condition, or is it something else?
In part, I think is a diminishing of somebody's experiencing and sort of make it as if it's part of regular life or you know, general population type of experience. We all have a degree of hearing loss, perhaps with aging. Correct me if I'm wrong, but perhaps there's some of that process is happening to everybody. Why are you complaining about your hearing loss? We're all having it. And similarly, like in the parallel mental health, or chronic fatigue syndrome, which is an eating disorder where, you know, at some point, you know, we all experience extreme fatigue, but chronic fatigue is something different. Or eating disorder where at some point in life we may have experienced some difficulties with food intake or weight and things like that. And then you think like, well, that's an eating disorder. We all experience some of eating related difficulties at some point in life. So that might be the parallel.
Okay, that does make a lot of sense. Okay, and just before we move to the panel, I'm going to ask one other question, and that was, and maybe this is about the modeling, but presumably a stigmatizing tweet would have different significance depending on who it comes from. If it's a thought leader, if it's the press, if it's just an anonymous person. Number one, is that likely to be true? And number two, is there any way that you can imagine that your modeling, etc., could differentiate between sources?
Saga, would you like to?
Yeah, I was going to say if I take that. That's correct. So when we're looking at the data, I'll start. When we're collecting the data, we can find out who's tweeting if it's a public profile, because we can get the username and the whatever bio and stuff. What we do find is that often it's like big charities or universities or like campaigners will often be tweeting, you know, like publications or, you know, a new study out now, or, you know, something along those lines, basically. And then anecdotally, when we're looking at the data, those tweets, you know, will be not stigmatizing. So those are the tweets that people identify as not stigmatizing or neutral. So we can. I think the question is, would it improve the model? We haven't tried it, but I'm sure, you know, if we can, all we need is a column that says, you know, is this a, you know, a thought leader, or is this a you know, somebody famous, something, a 0 and a 1, or a scale, and then we can add it to the model. Anecdotally, I'm not sure it's gonna. I mean, we're hitting quite a high accuracy already in the 90s. I'm not sure if it's going to add how much, but it's certainly when we've looked at the data, we can see that it's you know, famous people or charities and this sort of stuff are tweeting in a very different way to the anonymous or, you know, ordinary person.
Yeah, and presumably it's the impact it has on the individual if it comes from a thought leader versus an anonymous person. I think was sort of the thinking behind that question. Okay, let's move on now to the panel, because we have got limited time. I basically, like yesterday, we've got 3 panel members, and we are also going to keep Matteo and Segar on the call. And what we've said is specifically asked each of our 3 panel members to introduce themselves in a couple of sentences and then give a 3-minute overview of their research and thinking on social media. And in particular, I'm really keen to have a takeaway message from the work that they've done to date. So since we're limited time, I'm going to get started immediately. I'm going to start with Marika. Why don't you introduce yourself and just a quick 3-minute summary of what you want to say.
Okay, thank you, Gabby, for the introduction. So my name is Marieke van Meer. I work at Amsterdam University Medical Center at the section Ear and Hearing. I have a background in behavior change research and epidemiology, and I've been working in the audiology field for 2.5 years now. So I'm responsible for the Netherlands longitudinal study on hearing. And in fact, I've done a presentation on that study with data we collected in the 10-year measurement round of this cohort study. There are about 3,000 participants in this study. And with these data, we looked at social media use. And what we found that, and we compared people with a hearing impairment to people with normal hearing. And we found that people with a hearing impairment make less weekly use of social media. In terms of social platforms like Platform and Twitter, but only on a mobile device. If you ask about social media use at all, and on any device, and if you include things like direct messaging, WhatsApp, video calling, then there are no differences between normal hearing and hearing impaired people. We also found that hearing impaired people used social media to keep in touch with family and friends and to perform their work. They were more likely to use social media for those reasons, more likely than normal hearing people. And 26% of the hearing impaired people said that they use social media to gain new health knowledge, but that was not different between normal hearing and hearing impaired people. And at the moment, we're also looking at social media use during the COVID period. And there we asked about specific platforms. And what we see that Facebook use is somewhat higher among people with poor hearing. So in that group, 86% of the people using social media say that they use Facebook when they're hearing impaired. And that's 71% in the group who has good hearing. And Twitter use is fairly low, it's around about 20%, but it doesn't really differ between the two groups. And YouTube use seems a little bit lower, so it's 48% in poor hearing and 60% in good hearing. And there's also an age gradient, like people who are older tend to use social media less, but that's something that you see in the general population as well. So takeaway messages from our research. Well, foremost, be aware of who is on the internet and who's not, and be aware of who is on certain platforms and who's not. And people may have different reasons for using different types of social media, and that you can actually use maybe for developing interventions. Like what we found, people who are hearing impaired use social media to stay in contact with friends and family. So maybe we can use that to devise interventions that help with loneliness. And we also found that they tended to use social media to perform their work more than normal hearing people, and perhaps we can use that type of information for rehabilitation services. But that's something that's still in development. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Marika. Okay, Stephanie. Come on.
Hi.
If anybody else wants to mute themselves, if somebody's talking. Sorry, just to keep this signal clear.
Can you hear me okay? Yes, bro. Yeah, hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm from the University of Nottingham. I'm a PhD student writing up my thesis now, actually. And my research is all about chemotherapy-induced ototoxicity, hearing loss and tinnitus from chemotherapies like cisplatin and carboplatin. But I've also done some work on gabapentin as well, and if that is ototoxic. The way I've used, I guess, social media and the internet was to find out what people affected by ototoxicity were saying to each other. it's very different to what they will say to a clinician or their healthcare professional. So it's really interesting to sort of dive in to that research online. There were lots of questions, a lot more questions than answers, and people sharing their own experiences. So we analysed forum posts, thematically analysed forum posts for those who were experiencing it, and if they were actually aware that it was a side effect at all, which a lot of them weren't. So that's what my research is all about. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Vinay. Are you there? We can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Okay, everybody. I hope you all can hear me fine. I work in Lamar University in Texas. I have a background in audiology and also disability research. My research focuses on three different but related topics. The first
You have disappeared, Vinay.
I think I have some problem with the internet. I hope I'll
Why
repeat
don't
that
you
again.
turn off the video? Do you think if you turn off the video, it might be better? Much as we'd like to see you.
Yeah, I stopped the video. Hopefully, it is better now.
Yeah.
I have three research focuses. First, developing and evaluating internet intervention. Second, focuses on consumer health informatics. Looking at what information people are exposed to and how their decision making and behavior change as a result of that. And then the third focuses on direct-to-consumer hearing devices. So in the last few years, in all of these three areas, we are seeing increasing number of people interacting with information online and coming to us with series of questions. For instance, I saw an advertisement for a laser therapy for my tinnitus. Where can I get it? Things like that. And we were quite intrigued on how little we know on what's going on online. Our initial research started examining what's happening in different social media platforms. We have looked into what happens in Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Now we are doing some studies on Reddit data. We have applied both qualitative and quantitative methodologies, looking at a small number of messages in an in-depth way, as well as extracting large amount of data from things like Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit, and examining using some of the advanced natural language processing techniques, which Matteo and Sagar talked earlier. So our ultimate goal in this area of research is to understand what information is existing and how people interact with this and how their outcomes, help-seeking, use of rehabilitation, as well as satisfaction with the rehabilitation change as a result of its interaction. But I would say that so far our efforts have been mainly focusing on defining what information is out there, and we have made very little progress in understanding how this information relates to the outcome. Although we have been collaborating with some people in Hofstra University in developing what is called as an accuracy nudge intervention. Developing brief interventions that people can go through where they can learn how to navigate through much of the misinformation which is online. We are yet to analyze the results, but that is a really good direction for our research. Another really good direction that is happening currently is in the past, our work was mainly focusing on a small data set, and currently we are looking at a large data set developed from Reddit. We have more than 100,000 messages. And the nice thing about some of the platforms like Reddit is that people write a lot. Like, for example, if you look at some platforms like Facebook or Twitter, the messages are superficial, so we cannot gain much insights from that. Whereas Reddit discussions have been very insightful and a lot of in-depth description. This has helped us really define some new dimensions related to tinnitus that have not been discussed in the previous literature. So a takeaway message for me, I think as a researchers and a clinician, it is really important for us to know what happens in social media. I really believe that internet and social media is a neutral technology. Quite often we tell our patients not to look at internet and social media, but that is exactly what they do. I think we just have to find a good way to navigate through the system. And there are also some really good practices in social media. I mean, if you look at some of the Facebook groups, which are really well moderated, they are a way of providing social support. So I think we need to see this technology as a neutral technology, and also maybe think about how can we use this to our advantage in healthcare service delivery.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I agree. So I've got a question, and I hope it's a question that is something that you can all address. Is sort of, you alluded to, Vinay, the misinformation that's out there, which, you know, without doubt is true. And I thought it was interesting, Stephanie, in your presentation, where it appeared there were people who said, my doctor told me this, is it true? As if to say they trust the people out there more than they trust their doctor. But then the flip side of that is that maybe actually there are things that we can be learning from the general population, because the doctor doesn't necessarily know everything. And I'm thinking, you know, with vaccine side effects right now, I mean, we just don't know. And so by social media adding more and more information, maybe we will learn new things. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and how we manage it. How do you say, well, this is bad news, good news? How do we go about learning? Does anybody want to jump in on that one?
Maybe I can say something from mental health, because mental health is tend to be complex, and the approach that healthcare professionals have is a trial and error. It's very sad to say, but you know, for medication, you kind of try one, you try another, and for non-pharmacological therapy, that's often the case. So, as a clinician as well myself, I know that the honesty of saying, well, we think this is probably the best option for you right now, but we're not quite sure whether that's going to work, and sort of setting people up with this kind of mixed picture of, we haven't got a solution for you, but we've got something that we think might work, but we might need to work through various types of solutions. It sort of diminished the sort of skill set that, or the perceived skill set that clinicians should have in the eyes of a service user. And that kind of lends itself to what you just described, Gavi. People go and look at other things and kind of try to find out if the best therapy for that condition is what I've said, or is something that somebody else has said. And I think it's just to find a balanced view that, you know, sometimes things are complex, and sometimes, well, most of the time, always healthcare professionals are humans. They can do mistakes, and they don't have all of the knowledge. They rely on sort of best experience and knowledge and intention. And I guess, you know, people come back and say, I've seen these and these on social media or on the internet. It's fine. It's just part of, you know, how our society's open to information, how easy it is to gather information from all sources. I'm not sure I answer the question, but I kind of share what's happening in our field.
Yeah, well, I think it's worth putting out. Stephanie, have you got, you're nodding.
Yeah, I think as we go on with all this technology, and yeah, rightly so, even more so this year, the information that is out there is balancing between clinicians and patients. So you sort of used to go in where your doctor or your clinician used to know a lot more than you, whereas now we have Google, you can do your own research, and I guess that relationship is balancing out. What isn't talked about is the information they might have learned at school, and what you learn off Facebook and Google is very different. But if you haven't got the background in critical analysis, which lots of people aren't taught, you then get into the trap of misinformation and believing that. And all it takes is one bad experience with a healthcare professional for your trust to go down in any healthcare professional, and then share that and get more people. So yeah, I think mistrust in information and information coming from healthcare professionals is big, and that's why people turn to the internet. However, I think brushing that off and saying, don't go online, don't, you know, a lot of people say don't go online, and brushing that off may escalate that even more, because it's saying, no, trust me, don't believe what you read online. Some of it's true, you know, but I think it's really important to be transparent and say, okay, well, what have you read? Let's delve into this together. This is really interesting, like show me your thought process. And it needs to be more of a conversation rather than teaching or telling someone what is fact, because that's what's creating this us versus them dynamic. And it shouldn't be an us versus them. We are trying to solve this problem people are having together and manage, this health problem together. So I think, yeah, it's difficult because it can go either way.
Right, and also I think professionals stand to potentially learn something too in some instances.
I have 3 specific comments on this. First, really good comment. There is some studies on the medical literature suggesting that physicians who discuss what patients see on the internet have better chances of building a stronger relationship with the patient. So I think it's really important for us to start discussing what they've seen and also sharing our views. Number 1. Number 2, I think so far we have thought about misinformation in binary terms. This is a correct information, this is a misinformation, but there is a lot of gray area. So I think it's really important for us to think about
really important for us to think about. He disappears. Renee, you disappeared. Or maybe he will return. Marie, could you have anything you want to add?
I have some problem again. Okay. It is back.
Yes,
so the second point I was making was about thinking about misinformation as not necessarily black and white, but instead there's some gray area in between, and also looking at the intent of misinformation, like.
Oh dear. Marika, do you have anything you want to add?
Are people intentionally trying to mislead others to buy things? So I think the intention of misinformation is really relevant. And then the third point is there is a notion in healthcare that you can try things that do not have evidence, as long as because there is nothing to lose. But what we see with our internet intervention is that people before they come to us, they have tried 20 different things. And by the way of trying 20 different things, they have lost hope. Like tinnitus patients, they have lost hope because they've tried these 20 different things, which doesn't work. That is really bad, because if you're trying to lose weight, you can do all sorts of things. There is things on the internet saying, drink green tea, do this and do this. And if nothing works, at some point you'll give up on trying the things that work. So I think there is a really need for us to address this in our clinical consultation, so that people don't try things that doesn't work, and potentially that could have also harm, like a negative side effects, trying things that doesn't work. So these are my 3 comments on the misinformation.
Thank you. Marika, did you want to add something?
Oh, I really like the point that Stephanie was making. That this is a process that you go through as a caregiver and a patient together, and you have to value both points, both in information streams. And maybe I can tie this in with one of the questions that we got. Can you give specific Facebook groups that are helpful for supporting people with hearing loss and tinnitus? Maybe groups that we can point our patients to. I think this is, I wouldn't know if I need to be honest, but I think it's also something, it's so, things spring up and die out again. So it's very fleeting on the internet. So some groups might stay there for a longer time, but some die out. And I know, like in the Netherlands, they have tried to make a list of applications of apps, health apps, and value them for their health information, how useful they are. And they actually stopped doing this because I think one of the reasons was that it's really hard to keep up with what is being developed. So I think it's much more important, like Stephanie was saying, maybe help people with developing their critical thinking so they can value information and apps themselves and just work through it together. So I think that's very valuable, what she said.
I think that's an interesting concept, that or you know, idea that everything is so transient these days that you have to have a different mindset, I guess, when you're going into that.
Yeah.
Is that something that you come across, Matteo?
Very much so. I think there's well, to start with, in some other research that I was doing using devices and apps, the time you start, or the moment you start thinking about a trial, and you know, like an RCT takes you know, years to plan and implement and do, and you know, see the result through guidelines. You know, technology is already obsolete. You can't just do that the way you do with a medication. So you need to think creatively about how you explore and use technology, because these things move much faster than research, policymakers and organization used to think about. So the provocative thinking is really like, is the framework for evaluating this intervention, if you're thinking about technology and intervention and digital intervention, you know, valid for this type of technology, because you know they're not going to exist anymore by the time you finish the trial? Or should we sort of use a different framework where we use more kind of adaptive trials, or ways in which you kind of, you know, take what you have at the start, but then you develop with it? And also there's a lot of interfacing, and this is another thing that I found, between sort of no-profit organizations, university research entities, and private companies that, you know, do, you know, social media, do apps, do devices for profit. And that's a completely different world, because again, you move at two different speed, but also you have two different focus of interest. You know, you're interested in health, evidence, they're interested in profit. So how do you merge these together? And as that's an interesting, well, I had some very interesting conversation from, you know, that I've never thought I would have with my sort of clinical academic background in terms of IP and sort of making agreements with lawyers and things like that. So it is a world that requires academic, or I mean, us as a sort of research community, to be a bit more flexible in our thinking and interacting, interfacing, to understand, again, psychologically, you know, what is their interest, what is our interest, how we can come together and do, and also funders, because that's the other piece of the puzzle that needs to come together. Because if you want to do research, you need funding, and they need to agree with the industry and agree with the academic and of interest.
Yeah, and as you say, that randomized controlled trial notion as being, you know, the ultimate gold standard in research, just doesn't necessarily work in these situations. Interesting. Now, there's a question here that Vinay put out there that says, can you comment on stereotypes, which I think happen more often with hearing loss? Vinay, do you want to expand on what you were getting at there? If you're there.
Yeah, I was kind of getting at, you know, if you look at audiological literature and stigma theory, a lot has been written, but a good review a couple of years ago showed that they have seldom used the stigma theory. You know, they've just used the term stigma, but not really the theory. And also some work from Sweden, especially from Bert Danemark, kind of looked into this, suggests that when often people write about stigma theory, it's about stereotypes, not a wider stigma. So I was just basically getting into the core of how we define stigma in audiology and how that fits with the general literature broadly across the healthcare.
Matteo?
I'm asking if Matteo would have any comment on this.
I'm not sure about stigma in audiology, so maybe somebody else on the panel that has more experience in the topic.
I think probably we're all coming from the place that Vinay was commenting about.
But I mean, I sort of apply all of my sort of research to mental health, so I don't really have a good grasp of what's happening in audiology, and I should have had a look, to be honest, but it's probably something that other members of the panel are more qualified to talk about, I suspect.
I don't know.
I wonder if I may jump in, relates to stigma related to visible disabilities versus invisible disabilities, because hearing loss is not usually something that people can easily see, whereas somebody's perhaps broken leg is something that is obvious and people can observe and respond to differently.
Yeah, no, that's a very valid point. And if you look at the research on stigma, it tends to be on invisible condition, and stigma tends to focus more on invisible conditions. So wheelchair is a lot more evident than a mental health condition, a hearing loss. So that's very much the case. And if in our research and in most sort of research, the comparison is always between invisible conditions, and that's why we chose like 5 mental health and 5 invisible physical health conditions in our original study, because that's where stigma tends to focus.
Okay, I've got another thing. Now, let's assume everybody on this listening. Oh, sorry, my phone. Hold on. Let's assume everybody listening to this is very excited about the idea of doing research with social media. I'm guessing this is something you've all thought about. What are the pitfalls? Where could we go wrong with all this data that we're gathering and looking at and interpreting? Who wants to step in? I'm sure you could all say something about that.
So the first thing is that people will, like with a takeaway, people will write a bad review if they've had a bad experience. No one will really write or read a good review if they've had an average or better one. So I think the information out there can be very skewed, and it's just important to acknowledge that and be aware of that. And it's not saying that it's less important, but just because everything you read online is a certain way, especially with my work, it's a lot of people who are often quite desperate or confused. It doesn't mean that there aren't people who are also getting the support they need. And I think we've just got to acknowledge that there will be a lot of, skewed data or exaggerated opinions and stories, because you're sort of anonymous online, so it doesn't matter. You can go in on a comment which you probably wouldn't in person. As long as you acknowledge that in your research, I don't think it's a problem, because it's still as important. But I think it with all social media, we just need to be very, very aware of it.
Okay, what else do people want to add?
Yeah, I can add a few things. Oh, go ahead, Matthew.
No, please, you go.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, the first thing I see would be that for many people who want to do research in this area, it's really intimidating on how to extract data, what kind of sense can we make of the data, and also agree with the point that Stephanie made in terms of as a lot of the data is anonymous, or at least we treat them anonymous, it is kind of hard to generalize them. So I think that definitely more clear framework is needed on what specific questions we can answer using this data and what we cannot, what kind of inferences we cannot make from this data. I think social media is a great way as a hypothesis generating research, but maybe in the future it will have some things on the hypothesis testing research. But there are lots of development in doing experiments on social media, although we often say it cannot be done. They're actually using cluster randomization and kinds of things. There are lots of experiments being done in medical literature, so that is definitely possible. And I think the second important point is quite often audiologists may not be interested in doing social media, but may want to engage with social media so that they can take advantage of this information in their health care provision as well as in their business. That is also intimidating, but the nice thing is there are many online tools that they could purchase, and many of them are quite affordable. For example, if they want to follow some groups or pages and have all the analytics provided by report, there are many really nice tools that are coming up now, and those can be used to kind of know what's going on in the. I mean, instead of you being able to write the specific codes to extract data, these software tools that are customized for clinicians or businesses can really help you gather data and make meaningful sense of it. So just to give an example, if I tell you, oh, how do you extract data and perform a machine learning or cluster analysis on this. Very few people will be able to do it. But if that company will provide that services to you, then of course you can identify some pages or groups that you're interested in, have that software do the analysis for you. I think that would be a nice way to make this process easier.
Thank you. Okay. Matteo, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say there are a lot of technical challenges, but I think to ours eventually it mostly boiled down to a question to identify what is stigmatizing, and that is really what the person makes of that particular tweet or that particular comment or that particular sort of phrase on the social media. And I think this is a problem of appraisal, not a problem, it's a matter of like how people are appraising information, what is the impact, and what person is receiving that information. And I think if machine learning models or the technical algorithm that Saga described, they rely on a classification method. So it's either one or another. There are in life probably the more shades of grey and is a bit more complex. But I think deciding what is a hit is the key. And in order to do that, you have to relate to the people that are your target audience, and relate not to a few, but to many, and show them the tweets and show them the information and ask them what they think about it, what they consider it. Is it stigmatizing or not? And at the beginning, we started classifying tweets and information on a wider scale, and we had like yes, no, but maybe in between, and then we kind of try to tear apart in between to find out what makes a maybe stigmatizing Twitter like that. And I think what I was going to say with the bottom line of what I'm trying to say here is trying to relate as much as possible to the people that are going to use what you're trying to produce, so the information that you're going to make, or they're going to be the beneficiary of it. Because if you try to work it all out from your office, chances are you might not be on the money.
Right. And come to think of it, I mean, that again is one of these things that changes over time, isn't it? Is if you think 30 years ago, a statement that was a non-inflammatory statement today is unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And so even these models are going to, I suppose, have to keep changing and changing and changing.
Well, it's the use of language and culture changing inevitably introduces a lot of things, and there might be terminology that relate to a series, a movie, or like something that is just kind of popular, but then in a few years' time is gone, and it didn't exist 10 years ago.
Yeah, so it's pretty complex. Rika, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I was just thinking a bit about the points I was making. It's like there are still like what we found is like 75% of people who use social media never use Twitter. So it'd be quite interesting. It's like, who uses Twitter, and do they differ from the people who don't? And what kind of information gives you that about the value of what you found? Should you maybe do other types of research in those 75%? So I don't think that we should say goodbye to focus groups and other ways of collecting information.
Yeah, Vinay, I thought your idea that hypothesis generating is a really good point. Case in point is that so Kevin Monroe, you might have heard about his systematic review of the association between COVID and hearing loss, and he has been getting letters, like he's had, I don't know, 100, 200 emails from people. And he was like, oh, maybe we should look at these and see what we can learn. And I think to myself, but they are a very small subset of people that were felt strongly enough and motivated enough to write a letter about this. Are they really representative of everybody else? But I guess it's okay if you think about it as a hypothesis generation tool rather than this is, a definitive answer. I don't know, it's fascinating. Okay, I see we have officially 1 minute left. So I think, has anyone got anything burning they want to add before we end? Nope. Otherwise, I will say thank you so much for a really fascinating discussion. Thank you, Matteo and Sagar, who has appeared for wonderful presentation. And I guess we now have a 10-minute break, and then we will all come back for the next session. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So we just stay on now, is that right?
Yeah, we're going into the break. I'll share the screen. Participants can stay, and we'll just check with the presenters so that to make sure everything is working.
Great. I guess I disappeared too. Thank you.
Laura, you're on.
And now I'm unmuted. Great to have you all back for the second part of day 2. Today's panel is, the topic is clinical experiences and telehealth. And we have a wonderful panel for you today. I'm Laura Coco. I'm an audiologist and a researcher. I'm here in Tucson, Arizona, where it's really hot today. And we're all spread out all over the world, but today it's sunny and hot in Tucson, which is wonderful. And today we have, I'm just going to briefly introduce our panel and then allow them to give a more detailed description of what they do and how it relates to clinical experiences in teleaudiology. This is a really important topic. Obviously, it's something that's all on our minds, whether we're in clinic or in research, especially given the COVID-19 pandemic. I know in the US, where I am, especially as a researcher, my research was completely shifted in March when research kind of in-person research shut down. And I work in clinic, and we really had to shift how clinic looked. So I'm really interested from our panel to discuss how both research and clinic has shifted. So we have Eldre Birkus, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Lamar University and Angela Ruskin University. We have Michelle Arnold, an assistant professor at the University of South Florida. We have Christina Callahan, who is the head of clinical audiology at Lively Hearing Corporation. And we have Anna Pugh, a consultant and a hearing therapist, audiologist at Hearing Therapy Online. So between them, they just have tons of experience with clinical experience and teleaudiology, which is the topic today. And I'm just going to point to each of them to give a more of an explanation on their background. And also, if you could just tell all of us, what do you think is the most significant benefit to delivering hearing services remotely in your mind? So let's start off with Christina.
Great, thank you. So yes, I'm the head of clinical audiology at Lively. We are essentially, we're a startup. We've only been a company for a little over 2 years at this point when we launched. And we're a remote, we have a remote audiology platform where we are focusing specifically on hearing aid related services. Myself, I manage a team of remote audiologists across the states, literally from California to New York, audiology assistants and hearing aid dispensers. Yeah, I would say the most important part, or what I found the most valuable part in providing remote services, what I think many people already know here, is improving accessibility. We consistently hear from our clients that, they would not have received service if we had not existed and they had not found us. And there's many reasons for that, from literally not having a lot of professionals in a rural area that they might be in, from the one professional that they did have access to, they couldn't afford their prices to just not willing to go to the brick and mortar clinic for whatever reason. Yeah, accessibility, and in that you have the opportunity to improve efficiency and how you reach clients, so you can reach more people. And then in that you can pass cost savings on to them, and that improves the affordability as well, where they can get higher level technology at a price that is professionally supported rather than not at a price that maybe would not have been offered, especially those that don't have any insurance coverage. So, yeah.
Great, thanks, Christina. And Michelle, can you tell a little bit about your research and what you're doing in Florida, and what you think is the biggest benefit to delivering services online?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for having me on the panel today. I am a clinical researcher and also a clinician. My clinical research is primarily focused on increasing accessibility and affordability of hearing health care for older adults. And my research team and I have had some recent experience with not only conducting clinical-based research using telehealth as a primary means of service delivery for hearing aid visits in particular, but we also are the head of the audiology team for the Aging and Cognitive Health Evaluation, or the ACHIEVE study. It's a large multi-site study with over 800 adults aged 70 and older. And we had to completely transition all of the follow-up hearing care. So it's delivery of best practices, hearing intervention, including hearing aids and assistive devices and person-centered counseling. We had to shift all of that for 800 people when COVID started, and using all telehealth technologies and strategies. Something that we found in the clinical research side of things as an advantage of telehealth technology is it allows patients and participants greater flexibility in terms of being able to attend their appointments, being able to have their needs addressed easily by a clinician using both synchronous and asynchronous supports. So just the flexibility to use both of those in-person, face-to-face strategies, as well as things like emails, text messages, hearing aid manufacturers' applications where you can send a message or send a programming adjustment through a smart device. That's been really, really advantageous to us in our clinical care as well as in our clinical research.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Thank you. And Anna, can you tell us a bit more about your background and the benefits of remote care?
Yeah, I've been a hearing therapist audiologist for over 40 years now. And I've seen an awful lot of change in how services are delivered. And one of the things that I've always found is that people will come into clinic and say, but I can't hear in my kitchen, or I can't hear my television, or I can't hear this. And we'll make adjustments in clinic, and we'll perhaps play some sound files or go to the cafe down the road, but it's not the same as in their real world. And I'm certainly finding now that we can access via Zoom and via the technology, that they can be in their kitchen with their wife or their partner or their grandkids or wherever it may well be, and make those real life adjustments. And I think that's making an enormous difference to the engagement of people, to people wearing their technology, using all the benefits of their technology. My primary work is with people with tinnitus and with people with vestibular anxiety. And so a lot of my work is counselling and one-to-one. And when I started my online service, people were saying, but you can't get that same rapport, you can't get that same engagement with people. And I think that's been shown not to be the case. You're not going to catch everybody in those kind of scenarios, but I think it makes a huge difference that you can be in people's homes in a time that works with them, with their significant other, with their relationships, with their environment, and make that work for them. And certainly with a counselling perspective, it makes people a lot more receptive to counselling, certainly tinnitus counselling, because we're finding people, when they come to clinic, are already quite anxious, and then they come to clinic and the environment, no matter how lovely you make it, is still a non-home, non-domestic environment. And so there's always going to be that tension and that dynamic. And I've certainly found that with supporting people in their own environments has made a huge difference. So I'm very keen on moving forward with technology, and I think it's definitely the way we can move and support people in their real worlds.
That's a great point, Anna. That's something I want to follow up on later. It's really interesting. Is a unique aspect to remote care is seeing the in someone's home. So let's be sure to talk about that later. Eldre, what do you have to say?
Great, thank you very much for the introduction and for having me on the panel today. And so I started my career as a clinical audiologist, and I think during this time I was always looking for ways to improve service delivery. And in 2014, I heard a talk by Gerard Anderson about internet-based interventions, and it really caught me as something that could complement our services. And this led to me undertaking a PhD really to develop an internet-based intervention for tinnitus based on Gerard Anderson's model for population in the UK and evaluate this. So I think at that time in the UK, remote consultations weren't often used. So the project was met with a lot of resistance. But it's been really interesting to see developments since then and how attitudes have changed and how they've had to change in the last year as well. And because the project was such a success in the UK, we went on to try to improve accessibility. And I think that is really one of the key features about remote work, is that accessibility feature. To me, accessibility, especially in locations where people can't access other help, and maybe countries where clinics are scarce. So one part of the project, for instance, has been trying to look at minority groups and improve accessibility to them. So we translated the intervention into Spanish and to try to help people to have the intervention in their own language, which I think is really lovely. And I think that just shows the flexibility of remote care, is that we've got all these options. And my work's mostly been in tinnitus. And I think tinnitus is hugely complicated and can be approached from various different angles. So there are lots of strategies and techniques, and different elements work for different people. And being able to provide a remote intervention means that you can provide all these different elements and give people the opportunity to learn all these different strategies for them to find out which work best for them. And I think that's really empowering to them to, it's a whole new world. And also the flexibility to address people's own learning needs. So some people just learn better if they can revisit material. So if there's a video explanation and they can go back to it, I think that can be really effective as well. And I think we'll probably discuss this in more detail, but I think you can have so many different approaches, so people can have different ways of contacting you, but often that's more so often in clinics you can't always get an immediate appointment when you need it. You often have to wait, where with remote services, sometimes if there's messaging systems, people can get responses quite soon to questions they have, and people have really valued that. So yes, I think endless possibilities, especially in auditory rehabilitation, to improve patient outcomes with all kinds of problems we're dealing with.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for your insights. We have a really wide breadth of experience, just decades of experience cumulatively, and just you all bring to the table a lot of different areas of research and clinic. I think, and I just wanted to mention that each of you have contributed presentations. So if any of the attendees would like to see those, they're all available if you can look on the website. Eldre, I think your comments make a nice bridge to one of the questions in the chat. You talked about in your project that you contributed to a presentation to is internet-based tinnitus therapy, and you adapted it in Spanish. So one of the comments is on individuals with lower socioeconomic status may have, we know that they have difficulty accessing hearing services that are just in general, that are not, even when they're not provided online. So the question is, has the panel found any creative routes to engage telerehabilitation for individuals in low socioeconomic groups? So I wonder if, Eldre, you could comment on your adaptation of the therapy in Spanish and how you can provide access to groups, individuals who speak Spanish, and also anyone who wants to comment on increasing access for low SES groups. Eldre.
Thank you for the question. I think that there's still definitely many challenges, and I think with different cultures, you need to know a lot about the culture because they are going to engage in different ways. And what we found with the Spanish group especially is they need to build up a lot of trust before they'll engage in the intervention, and that's quite difficult to build up. But I think trying to improve, what we try to do is try to get Spanish people that are patients and engage them. And so I think depending on the kind of intervention, if there's any materials that are remotely accessible, and you're not only including professionals, but maybe videos of patients, that could be really handy. With the professionals, it was really hard to find Spanish professionals. So we did have the videos and subtitles in Spanish and Spanish overlays. But I think some of the materials are quite complex, and just being able to read it in your own language is really helpful. So we can definitely improve on doing the videos and the audio in Spanish, but having at least some written information in Spanish was very helpful. We also had to have on our intervention, the person that provided it was Spanish themselves, and I think that helped a lot. That's not always going to be possible, but if I guess as clinics develop, those are things that people can look out for, is having, one expert in an area and letting them see people not only in that area they are, but in wider areas because they speak that language. So I guess maybe working together as professionals is one way forward as well.
Yep, definitely. Christina, maybe you could comment on your experience as a clinician and how telehealth has the ability to, responding to this comment, increase access in terms of geography, but also economically, and reduce costs.
Well, in the case that Lively and the work we're doing, we're still, being newer, dependent on like private pay for, so I want to make sure I recognize that there is some, in very low socioeconomic classes that they might still not be able to access some of our technology. That's something that we have a goal of by continuing to improve our processes, our efficiencies, and starting to integrate other types of technology, potentially OTC, when those regs finally come out, that we can help unlock for those from within who we do work with. it's saving thousands of dollars. So like if they, you know, had in their particular situation, the clinician that they had experienced had only been offered a very high price point of $6,000. Not all clinicians offer different tiers. That could knock them out for care, saying, okay, well, I can't do that. So even if our care, let's say, costs anywhere from, you know, $1,800 to $2,400, that is something that you know, people can potentially save up for a lot sooner, that they can go on a payment plan, that they can, you know, access it that way. You know, the other thing that I think is important is sometimes with people with very low mobility, you know, and can't get out of the house easily, and then also can't afford the type of like services to get themselves out. That's where they've been able to, I can get these hearing aids and I can afford to save up for the care, and then I don't have to worry about figuring out all the costs with travel and transportation and getting help. So that's where we've had reports. I'm not sure if that answers it particularly, but from the type of folks that we work with.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that's an important point to consider, is that it might not be a cost saving, although you did mention cost saving in terms of devices, but also like where I live in Southern Arizona, if your clinic is an hour plus away, you're saving costs in terms of travel. It might have to take half a day off work. So it could be cost saving in
things like that. We hear a lot. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. I want to, if someone else has a comment on that question, then feel free to jump in, but we do have yep, thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that in the US, there have been some pretty significant legislative efforts to increase accessibility and affordability of telehealth. So, for example, Medicare will reimburse audiologists for telehealth services for Part B enrollees and Advantage enrollees now, whereas those services previously were not reimbursed. There are different state regulations for Medicaid, but in the state of Florida, for example, Medicaid beneficiaries, the audiologists can be reimbursed for services, but Medicaid beneficiaries are now for the first time able to seek out services across state lines, including telehealth services, which will also be reimbursed. So these are, some of us are interested in these types of temporary legislative acts becoming more permanent and more stable, because I do think that these sort of things, especially for Medicaid beneficiaries in states where hearing aids are provided, that it does bridge the socioeconomic gap between access and non-access. Appointments can be more flexible. A lot of these individuals have to work full time. They're not able to come to a 9 to 5 clinic appointment. Also, oh, what else was I going to say? I had another really interesting point to make, but I forgot what it was. Maybe it'll come up in the future.
Well, those are really good
points. I just wanted to point out like those changes in legislation that, you know, hopefully some of them will be maintained beyond the pandemic.
Yep, and there have been a number of changes in, for example, there is a HIPAA change. There's more flexibility in the platforms that you can use for telehealth that is temporary, and that's introducing, so a number of people have been using telehealth during the pandemic, and it's yet to be seen if people will continue to use remote care after the pandemic. But things like insurance coverage, pay, those are crucial for, like you said, low-income groups in terms of accessibility. We have a lot of questions from the chat. One question is related to the types of services that can be provided remotely. So two of our panelists, probably more, but your research and in clinic is related to tinnitus rehabilitation and therapy. That seems to me like a more straightforward service that can be delivered via telehealth. So in terms of the technology that's needed, but there are some like diagnostics and hearing aid fitting, those may need a bit more equipment.
So are there some services that are more difficult? Are there some services that we're not able to deliver remotely? And maybe any of you can probably comment on that. Who wants to jump in?
I'll just throw myself into this one. Yeah, I think that diagnostic testing has been an issue, and I think certainly initially a year or so ago, people were very concerned about how that would work. And I know that there are companies who are working on the issue around being able to provide remote otoscopy with their little portable kits that can arrive on your doorstep, that we then as audiologists can link into or feedback asynchronously. So I think a lot of that sort of initial concern that many of us had about the diagnostic things, technology is working around and thinking of solutions. Whether that's going to be completely practical or not, I can't really tell, but I think that it's quite interesting. And I think it's very interesting that that's a move there are at least 2 or 3 companies that I know of that are working on those kits that can go to people's homes and calibrated tests and otoscopy, and then fitting. Nobody's yet managed REMS as far as I know, but you know, I'm sure. Not quite sure how they do that, but you know, you never know. But I don't think it's an insurmountable thing. I think the issue for audiologists is that the audiologist has to separate themselves from the kit and remember that we are a person service, and maintain that importance of making those relationships and thinking that hearing is more than just a piece of technology. It's a lifestyle, it's a communication, it's all of those things. And I think sometimes as audiologists, we get so bound by the kit that we forget why we're fitting the kit. And I think telehealth can give us those things. It's just a suggestion. I'll be quiet.
No, that's wonderful. Yeah, it's important to think outside of the box, and if anything, the pandemic has kind of forced that upon many of us. Michelle, maybe you can talk about how hearing services has worked at your clinic, your university clinic during the pandemic, how you've adapted to that.
Sure. So I think the most difficult thing that we had to face during the pandemic was, what do we do with patients who are hearing aid users and cochlear implant users I'm not a cochlear implant audiologist, so I'm not as familiar with the software, but in terms of hearing aid software, some manufacturers, you cannot activate the remote technology unless the person is in office. So for those who had already had that remote technology activated and had gone through our step-by-step with our student clinicians on teaching them how to pair that hearing instruments with their smartphone, and how to download the manufacturer's application for the smartphone, and how to sync up with the audiologist using whatever platform they're using, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. For those patients who received all that upfront training in office, it was pretty seamless transition. For those that did not, which tended to be our old patients, because they're a little more hesitant to do those things in office, those are the ones that I don't want to say we struggled. We did have workarounds. So for example, we had some curbside services where we would have the people come by, drop off their hearing aids curbside, touchless, no contact. Student clinician would bring in the hearing device. We would do all that. We'd bring in their hearing device. They would glove up, they would mask up. I mean, they were head to toe in PPE. They'd bring in the patient's cell phone or smartphone, bring in the hearing device, do all of that work, and then send them home with it and try to work through accessing some of the remote technology. So I would say curbside touchless services during the height of the pandemic were open now. Patients can come and see us face to face. They were like banging our doors down to come back face to face. So maybe we can talk about that later. A lot of people do not want to use telehealth services, even if they're available to them. They were banging our doors down to come back. But yeah, I think that ability to do some of those things curbside, especially for cochlear implant users. And again, I'm not a CI audiologist, but if your cochlear implant speech processor stops working, you have no hearing. You're completely deaf. And those individuals we had to really do some like emergency stuff for. So there was a period of time, and I'm sorry if I'm getting off track, but there was a period of time where we had an executive order from our governor of stay-at-home order, and all non-essential health services, all elective surgeries, everything ceased to continue. We had to have a letter from the sheriff for one cochlear implant audiologist to be able to go into our clinic to assist those whose CIs had stopped working so they could at least have sound. So we did have some pretty crazy imaginative workarounds. It did involve explaining to the sheriff's department why we needed one clinician to be able to access the clinic. But yeah, we did all sorts of things to try to get people on board for remote services.
Wow. Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I will. You know, I was one of the first employees at Lively in pre-launch, so I was tasked originally with building a remote service model and figuring out, as related to hearing aid services, what can we and can we not do remotely. And what really stuck to me, Anna, is what you said, is that we're more than just our equipment. We're more than just, you know, and when building it, we're more than the test itself. We're more than the hearing aid itself. There's a lot we bring, and when you look at the research of what makes someone successful in our realm, like hearing aids, it's our professional service and our consultation. So I was like, well, we could definitely do that remotely. So that's a win. And then figuring out all these other details. And so the way we went about building it, that I would encourage anyone else thinking about it, is I didn't go in and go for every single, like, okay, well, I have to solve, like, how do I do Relayer, which, yes, that's tough doing that remotely. We have remote in situ now, which is super exciting. The technology is great, and initial fittings, the best fits, you know, oftentimes do really well. People do like it, which helps. But it's not a replacement. More what I did, though, instead of thinking like in getting stuck, because that's what happens if you obsess over the thing that you don't have access to, you get stuck and you won't create a model that really can unlock care for a lot of people. So what you do is like, what's my goal? Like in our case, I'm like, we want to get more people hearing aids. And what do we want to do with that? We want people to be successful with such hearing aids and have access to something they would not afford in a convenient and delightful way. Someone else mentioned that too. Like, you know, we want them to enjoy it as much as possible. There's something very cold about a clinic. There's something so much warmer about their home. Let's leverage that. And how do I get them there? So that's where, when I thought diagnostics, I'm like, okay, we're limited in terms of diagnostic testing, but what does the person I'm serving want? They want a hearing aid. How can I leverage an online test to get them that hearing aid? Okay, so we need enough information for me to program it, right? But then what would be the caveat to that was there's all this other important stuff in diagnostics. Well, are the clients aware of that or not? We need to know if we need to refer. How do we look in the ear? What if they need an ear cleaning? They don't realize they've been clogged for a while. So then you go, okay, well, how do I solve for that in a different way? Because if I get stuck with diagnostics and equipment's the only way I can determine the need for referral, you're never going to get this program off the ground. So, you know, we have gotten very creative on leveraging, we leverage a tool that is so essential called the CEDRA, which is the Consumer Ear Disease Risk Assessment, meant to support over-the-counter models. And we leverage it with professionals. So that makes it that much more powerful to figure out. And there's other ways, like we can do a lot. And I think that's something that the remote audiologists we've hired have said, like that they enjoy about remote care, that they're like, we have to look inward and remember everything we were trained on and everything we know. And we got to rework it in another way. And you almost have to know it so deeply that you're able to provide that service and not be limited by what you usually would not have. So when building it, I think, like in thinking what services you offer, I think you should start with what is my goal? What service do I want to unlock? And then think of how you account for those other stuff. And then maybe you won't do everything the way you once did, but you still will, again, get really great outcomes.
And putting the person in the mix and in front is so important. We sometimes forget that the reason that we're doing this is to help somebody hear better. And you know, I think that's so right, Christina. I really do.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. Thinking about the angle and keeping the client or the patient in mind and really thinking outside of the box, all of you. Yeah. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, and you touched on this a little bit, Michelle, but any of you can answer this question. Is there characteristics or maybe some patient that sticks out in your mind that is the ideal user for remote services, or something that that you really look for in a patient that they really need this characteristic to be able to be successful in receiving either synchronous or asynchronous hearing care? And if they don't have this, then what is the workaround that's needed? If they don't have this, maybe you do need to have curbside pickup suggested, or any comments on that?
So I can make a few comments. I think it's probably one of the most difficult things we've tried to work out is always predictors of who would be best for these remote services. And I think part of the question is lifestyle. So it's been an absolute lifesaver for people that, say, have to work out of the country, but they can access the internet, and they've just really found that helpful. People that are, say, working or have young children and find office hours difficult, I found it hugely beneficial. And people with children, they can just focus at night, and if it's something they can do by themselves. And I think it depends on your model as well. So some people, in the context of our intervention, a lot of it's a blended approach. So some of it is professionals guiding and doing bits yourself. So with tinnitus, it's saying, oh, this can be really helpful for your tinnitus, but go and try it this week. Spend some time doing it. So they need to do that themselves. And I guess that's going to be the same with the person in clinic. You're going to do the same thing, but not everyone's going to have the motivation to go do it or make the time or make the commitment. And it's really hard to pick out those patients, but they often put down the unsuccessful treatment to other factors and not the fact that they haven't done anything you've asked them to do. And so I think that's a really important aspect. But I think a lot of the people that started on our interventions didn't have other options, and in the beginning they really weren't hopeful. So we asked them some reasons why they started and what their motivation was and what they expected. And some had tried other things and they just said, oh, nothing's worked. I don't think this is going to work, but I'm giving it a go. And they've been pleasantly surprised. But we have looked at predictors of who'd be better, say, with their severity scores or anxiety and depression, and they're not clear predictors, which is probably a good thing, that it can be lots of factors involved. But I think partly lifestyle, partly personality, partly some clinical factors. If a lot is going on, if they're having other treatments for cancer, it might just not be the right time for them. So I think lots of factors, but no, I don't think there's a definite set, but there are outcome measures you can use to try to pinpoint who might be better. But I think some people that don't seem to be ideal candidates actually have done really well, even though they haven't been motivated in the beginning.
I can add a little bit to that as well. I don't know if there is an ideal or not ideal person for using telehealth. I think that if we think about telehealth in the limited scope of it can only happen over the internet, then perhaps a limiting factor is whether or not someone has access to the internet, right? But if we think about it as using, also phones, standard landline phones, emails, things that maybe don't necessarily involve the internet, then we can consider it a different way. But I think that at the end of the day, and we're a university-based clinic, so we tend to get some of the more difficult, the referrals for patients that have had limited success in other practices in our surrounding areas tend to get referred to the university clinic. And I find that for the majority of patients, and when I say majority, I mean like 80% or greater, if we are able to take time to provide them with like mastery experiences where they can do things that improve or increase their self-efficacy to achieve the task at hand, whether it's learning how to change a hearing aid battery for an older adult who's suffering from macular degeneration and has had a new significant change in their sight, or learning how to insert and remove hearing aids with ear molds for an older adult who has Alzheimer's disease. These are all things that we've been able to accomplish. So we found that by taking time, and again, by time I'm not talking like hours, like an extra 10 to 15 minutes to just provide the hands-on learning mastery experiences for the patients that might be ones that struggle accessing the technology, using the smartphone, using the apps, using the iPad or whatever it is they're using, that those people can be successful if you give them the opportunity to do it in front of you and you practice with them. And then you give them straightforward, plain language, step-by-step instructions in a way that they can understand it when they get home, then they tend to be successful. We haven't had a lot of just straight up failures with patients who have not been able to whatsoever use telehealth. Before, during, and now kind of Florida thinks we're post-COVID. So I don't know if we are, but our state thinks we are. So before, during, and post-COVID, we've had not too many like just failures. Most of our patients are successfully able to use some or all telehealth technologies.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move to the next question because we have a lot to get through and time is running. So let's talk of another question from the chat is, effect do you think teleaudiology will have on recruitment and retention of audiologists? For example, do you think there'll be an increased ability to work from home or hours with the increase in remote care? Maybe Christina can talk about that because your business is all remote.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, for us, yeah, our audiologists, we're and still hiring. We before, through the pandemic to now have more than doubled our team. That was something that was pretty incredible. It was really, I know, sad to see in the States during the pandemic, so many people lost their jobs or furloughed or laid off, and it was really nice to be able to hire. I can tell you the interest from that. It was the amount of applications we got was overwhelming, way more than we had the room to hire for. And to date, it's still the case. Hundreds and hundreds of applications. There's a lot of audiologists out there really interested in remote work. Yeah, they fully are remote. It's a full day, scheduled appointments. It looks very similar, except they're sitting at home at their desk on a computer. Yeah. So that would be my experience, and people have been very pleased with the position. Really, we have a very high retention rate once they have the position that they're really happy. So that's when it fills, it doesn't open up. From experience, we're still a newer company. It doesn't open up again soon. So it's been great to see providing another channel for audiologists to work.
And if I could tack on another question, Christina, because you probably have some perspective on this, given that you are a clinician, telehealth, and in person, although any of you can probably chime in on this. Someone's asking the question, what is the no-show rate for patients who are seen remotely versus in person?
Yeah, we had to work on this. At first, the no-show rate was pretty high. I would have full days and I would sit by myself at my desk all day because we realized that a lot of the demographic that we're appealing to need reminders, and people in general need reminders. So with finding that perfect balance of text reminders, email reminders, things that are automated, so we're not depending on a live person to verify every confirmation. We have way too many patients for that to be possible. No, our show rate is 95%. So rarely are people missing their appointments. But again, that took a lot of, like, that was not out the gate. We had to put a lot of procedures in place to achieve that. It was like 10% at the beginning. So.
Great, thanks. There's also a question about research comparing outcomes of teleaudiology and in-person care. So just in general, Eldre or Anna, maybe?
Yeah, so I've done some research looking at that. So we did a randomized control trial comparing people having tinnitus care in person, so the standard care provided in a tinnitus specialist clinic in hospitals, against people having an internet-based tinnitus intervention. I think with tinnitus, one of the complications is that people might have a hearing loss. So for everyone, we addressed the hearing loss first. So if they needed hearing aids or any sound-based care, they weren't denied that. They got that. So they got the hearing aids, or if they got any sound generators, they could get that. And then they were randomized to either group. And the way that the statistics were done is something called a non-inferiority trial. So you wanted to look, is the gold standard, which is seeing in person, how does the internet-based compare to that? Can it meet up to that? And it did. So we got, you set a margin, and both groups basically performed similar. But if you looked in depth, a lot of the scores for the internet group were higher. But similar outcomes are possible. But then I did qualitative interviews with all the participants, and the people that got in-person care loved the in-person care, and were so complimentary about everything that happened. So they thought they got a really good service. And the people that got the internet-based care were also, they were delighted with their care as well. And it, because they were randomized, it was different demographics, and each had different things they said, but themes that came out from both were that they really built up a relationship with the person that was helping with them, the professional, because on the internet-based intervention, there was guidance via audiologist. Most of it was sort of email messages, but they really did build up a rapport, and they liked the fact that they could send these messages, ask questions any time of the day or the night, and they'd get a response quite timely, where they felt that wouldn't always be possible in the clinic. They'd have to maybe wait for an appointment. So there were lots of parallels that people were saying exactly the same thing. The positives both were the same, although the treatments were so variable, and the outcomes were really good. And I think there has been a lot of research comparing, and things like you were asking about people that say don't arrive at treatments. Research has shown that's similar. Face-to-face, in-person, and internet or remote consultations are more or less similar. So I think lots of similarities.
I would certainly agree with that. I've found that certainly for some of the people that I work with my tinnitus support, the fact that they can email me and they feel comfortable to email me when they're in crisis, or when they're having a bad day, or when they just need that little extra jolly along and prompt. I think that's been quite useful. So a text or an email has been quite useful for them. And I do provide a face-to-face clinic, but my majority of work is online. And I've certainly not felt, I haven't done any qualitative stuff, measurements as such. Hands up, I have not done any measurements as such. But certainly my anecdotal evidence is that, I'm pretty full. So people seem to like it. I think the problem I find is that by the time people get to a hearing therapist, certainly in the UK, they've been really struggling with their tinnitus, and they, I tend to be the last port of call. So whether they're satisfied with my service or whether they're grateful that there's somebody there is something that perhaps we could look at, you know, at one point with some qualitative methodology. But I certainly at the moment, I don't see that there's any distinction between what people get. Well, I would hope that there's not any distinction between what people will get on a face-to-face or online. And in fact, online they can get me more easily, which is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not sure.
Thank you. Yep. Good comments on the research that's out there. I just also wanted to add that there have been a number of validation studies. So within subjects, face-to-face and remote care in terms of diagnostics and hearing aid fittings, and then the added component of satisfaction, and they've shown to be very similar. So good comments on that. And another question from the chat is related to privacy and how privacy is regulated for healthcare professionals who are using telehealth. We talked about that a bit with Michelle related to, in the pandemic, HIPAA regulations are relaxed, and that's temporary in order to increase access for clinicians who don't have the ability to create a business associate agreement with Zoom, for example, which can be, you know, it's cost prohibitive and can be a barrier. So now clinicians can use FaceTime or the regular Zoom or Skype or any kind of platform. But this question is more general. How is privacy regulated when using remote care? Any of you, I think, can comment on that. Who would like to step in?
I think for us,
oh, sorry.
oh, sorry. You know, making sure that all the messages sent are encrypted. So having those kind of, so all that HIPAA compliance stuff, really making sure it is in place is one thing. And then depending on what kind of remote service you using, ours there's access to materials, but you need a secure login. And we've got different levels of access as well, that if, you know, if someone was to break into the system, that, you know, lots of security things. So I think things do need to be in place. But also even the people that are on the team, that you can't necessarily have access to everybody's data, that there are levels. But I think looking at the HIPAA compliance starting there, and making sure things are encrypted and in place. So I think it is an important aspect, certainly, and to give people the reassurance that their data will be safe with you.
I just wanted to add on to that question. So this is something that you brought up, Eldre, in your introduction, that it's a benefit to delivering services remotely, that the patient, it may be in their home and they may feel more comfortable. That's something that our keynote speaker Anne mentioned yesterday. But is it also, have you also found that patients may feel more hesitant to share private information because they're not in person? Have any of you found that?
So what I found was that, especially with the qualitative work, a lot of people said they're just not the kind of person that will go to a physician or doctor and say they've got a problem. They find it really hard sort of taking that first step to contact someone and say they've got the problem, where they felt the remote intervention gave them sort of a bit of kept their privacy in a way. So, you know, they didn't have to, they could get the intervention without having to give away too much. So I think for some people, it gave them the option to get care they wouldn't have got because they were just not that kind of person. And I got that a lot, that people like that aspect that was a bit more private.
I certainly had that with the counselling. Lots of people were saying that it's very difficult for them to say they're going to a counselling appointment because of the connotations of that. And so the fact that they could have just I'm having an hour on Zoom with Anna about my hearing is not quite the same, and there was a very much a privacy and confidence thing with that. On the other hand, there is always the risk that, like any online issue, we need to make sure that people are safe, that they are, when they are disclosing, that they're not disclosing anything that would be a concern to those people around them. And sometimes when people come to clinic, they can be more open because they're on their own. And if they're in their sitting room with their significant other, perhaps they're not as comfortable to say, she's driving me mad because she's not listening to me. I'm not sure. So I think that there is an element of that we all need to take into consideration when we're developing services and we're delivering the one-to-one session with somebody, is that we have to be aware of their context, don't we? And I think that's really important.
We have found that, I mean, I think what I'm hearing from this, I'm like, it depends. It depends on the situation they're in at the time of the telehealth appointment. But from my experience, seeing clients that way, and from the audiologists on my team, a lot of them have reported they feel they can actually have more enriching conversations, that there's something that puts them at ease being at home, or something that was really interesting that one of our clients said to us, and we've heard it a few times since, was they're like, I actually feel like I truly have your undivided attention because I have you right here on this screen, versus when I'm in the doctor's office, there's a temptation to go into a drawer. You're writing down, you're on the software simultaneously, someone walks into the room quickly. It's this, like, there's no choice. You're on a video. Like, it'd be kind of weird if you went like this in the middle of a video. So it forces that and kind of limits distractions. But of course, yeah, we definitely have had it if their partner's at home and their partner's the source of their stress, they might not say something. But yeah, also sometimes they can be helpful. It just, yeah, depends. But definitely, I don't think takes away telehealth from the ability to do that. And regarding HIPAA, just to mention, there are a lot of platforms that are already encrypted, already HIPAA compliant. I know at Lively, we were like, let's look at what's already out there and built that will be HIPAA compliant. And that we were able to, leverage a lot of resources that way. And from EMR, scheduling, as well as, a HIPAA compliant Zoom, which is much more costly for clinicians, but there's some other smaller companies that have it that might be a little more attainable. And yeah.
Good, thanks for mentioning that. It sounds like it just makes me think what Eldre said, you have to have what some people may feel more comfortable in their home, but it's also important to explain to them what security and privacy settings have been set in place, just to provide some reassurance as well. Maybe the last question, because we just have a couple of minutes left, so just 2 minutes left. If anyone can answer very briefly, I just want to make sure this important question gets addressed. Can the panel members speak a little bit about the triage model that they are using? So the clinical decision-making process. I think this question could be addressed pretty quickly. So whether you're going to treat a patient purely in a virtual way, or in person, or hybrid appointment. Maybe Michelle could talk about that.
Yeah, I can speak on this. And I think I have a sort of a unique insight because we are so open in the state of Florida. Actually, our governor just passed an executive order that all COVID mitigation stops on July 31st. So we basically, when people call us, if something's broken, they either come in office or they drop it off curbside. So in terms of triage, if something on their device is broken, that's what they do. If there's just a need for an updated programming for those who are set up to do that, they can choose, the patients can choose whether or not they want to come in face-to-face or do a remote appointment. And that's essentially our system. And in the majority of healthcare providers in the state of Florida, that's been what the system has been for the past several months. So even when I have to make an appointment for myself or my daughter, the person on the other end of the line taking that appointment request asks, do you want a telehealth appointment? Do you want to come in person? And so that's kind of how we're doing it here. That's our strategy, for better or for worse.
Great. Does anyone have final thoughts? Anything last minute that they'd like to share? We have 1 minute left.
I was just going to say needs assessment and case history is key to triage right up front. And then sometimes it's simply as if they're not finding success via telehealth, never be afraid to pull the trigger and encourage them and educate them why they should go in person. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
And,
Well,
and
I appreciate you. No, go for it. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, in Gabby's point, you know, ask people what they want. Give them the option.
Good point. And that, I think, sums up the theme for the panel today, which was, in my mind, could be summarized to put the patient at the center, adapt to what's needed, think outside of the box. I think you all spoke to those points. So really wonderful conversation today. Thank you all so much for your expertise and the discussion. I think we'd like to point all of the attendees to GatherTown. I think there were a few questions that we weren't able to get to. One of them, a couple of them may be addressed if you could go to GatherTown and chat with the attendees if you're available. They could also be addressed if you could look at the presentations. So sorry that we were strapped for time. We really could talk about these topics all day long, and that would be nice if we were able to, but we've all got things to do. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we'll put the link to GatherTown in the chat. It's also on the website. There we go. Okay, thank you. Good to see you all.
Thank you all so much, and we hope to see you in GatherTown and or tomorrow to continue the discussion of telehealth.